So Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So that's Ilal al-Hadith. So we looked at Ilal al-Hadith before, and we looked at this book in reality is not just Ilal al-Hadith. This book is two things. This book is in reality a primitive, and I say primitive in the sense that it's primal, right? From the early stages of Mustalah al-Hadith. What is Mustalah Hadith? The science of analyzing Hadith. So in reality, what this book is an addendum at the end of Jami' Tirmidhi. There's Jami' Tirmidhi by Imam Tirmidhi. There's an addendum to it where he's talking about his systems, concepts, specifics of narrators, and then ilal themselves, right? And so in reality, it is one of the first books ever written on Mustalah al-Hadith. So if you wanted to have an idea about Mustalah al-Hadith, how does it work? You could read this book. It's not the best pedagogy because it's very, again, it's not super well organized. That book, also, for example, the Muqaddimah, the introduction of Sahih Muslim, right? It is an introduction to Mustalah al-Hadith. Also, the Kitab al-Tamyiz by Imam Muslim. It is demonstrating how we do these things. Also, the Risala of Imam al-Shafi'i, right? He talks about certain things there. But it's not very good pedagogy because, again, it's not very well organized. It's not very clear. If you compare it to something like al-Bayquniyah, it's very, very different. Not so well organized. All the chapters are not there, etc. Right? But there's a key thing to understand that with hadith, in contradistinction to something like grammar, something like fiqh, something like aqidah, something like tajweed, it doesn't need to be so organized, right? Because hadith is a bit like mixed martial arts, right? So imagine, for example, somebody who says, mixed martial arts, that's a joke, right? That's not a real thing, right? You have to master a martial art first. You say, okay, sure. So then you go and do 10 years of karate. And after your first week, you realize this is ridiculous. Why am I doing, I don't really fully understand this type of karate or that type of karate. So before I do 10 years of karate, I'm going to do a PhD in Japanese history. And then before I do my PhD in Japanese history, I'm actually going to learn Japanese. So this person spends 10 years learning Japanese, then another 10 years doing his master's and PhD in Japanese history, and then another 10 years of doing karate, and then starts to do mixed martial arts. Do you think that's a clever way to do things?
Afwan, is it okay for us to unmute and answer?
Bismillah, go ahead.
No, I wouldn't agree so because what they studied was not necessarily congruency with what they wanted to do. So they
Yeah.
studied Japanese, but they wanted
So,
to do
so how
MMA.
would you do it, right? Musa, you want to do mixed martial arts. Like, what do you think? Do you think you should have no discipline? Like, you shouldn't know anything about any martial arts specifically?
No, I think it would make sense to do like a little at a time. So like you take one of karate for a bit, and then one of whatever another like Muay Thai for a bit, and then
Okay. But
like
would you do
become.
any? So would you do? When would you start sparring?
I think sparring would be very important to undertake whenever someone both feels that they're ready, but also their teacher believes that they're ready.
Okay. So after
Um,
10 years, after a week, after a day.
I would say probably after a year or two, probably a couple years of
Okay.
true actual dedication.
Okay. Okay. But could you? Okay. What about being a mechanic? Like when it like you want to become a mechanic, when should you start playing around with wrenches and oil and stuff like that?
Yeah, for being a mechanic, I think probably as soon as possible. That way, like in a field like that, it really requires hands-on experience to become
Mhm.
proficient in it.
Right. So there's sciences that are purely theoretical, right? Like usul al-fiqh is not really true, but in principle usul al-fiqh, in principle kalam, in principle nahu, in principle fiqh. Like in fiqh, if you have a good pedagogy, you sit down and study 3 books in fiqh, right, in one madhab, you will have quite a good system in your head. right? It's very much different. It's very different to being a lawyer, right? Which is a lawyer, which is a lot of hands-on politics, how to talk to people, how to convince people, how to present your case, etc. It's slightly different, right? But fiqh, like you could quite good at fiqh, if you just study like three books of fiqh, like you're going to be quite useful, right? Kalam, the same thing. Nahu, the same thing. Tajweed, right? Tajweed, obviously, you have to practice practically, right? But otherwise, like the theory of Tajweed, you can be pretty good at theory of Tajweed. If you did like three books in Tajweed, that'd be pretty good. Like you know this, you know that, etc. Whereas Hadith, it's not like that. Hadith, it is research. So if you just sit around reading books, I mean, theoretical books, you've done Mustalah Hadith 1, Mustalah Hadith 2, Mustalah Hadith 3, 4, 5, but you've never picked up a hadith and started playing around with it. Or you never picked up, this book, never picked that book, you're not really going to go anywhere because it's just not like that. It's like somebody who says, again, to become a mixed martial artist, they did that 10 years of Japanese and then 10 years of postgraduate studies and then 10 years of karate and then they're starting. It's like, come on, bro, I mean, that's just, I can understand, obviously that's a great thing if you live for eternity, but, you know, let's just get in the ring a little bit. Let's see some scenarios that come up. Okay, you're on the ground, you're this, you're that, and then you start kind of, working with you obviously need some kind of structure here and there, but you need to get down and do things, right? Um, Archaeologist, like you can't, it's not just all theory. Like you do have to like learn how to dig and play with things and realize, oh, it's like this and like that. And, actually the kind of experience happened when you were actually at a dig and you found things. So many things will click in your head that don't really make sense just reading a book, right? So hadith is like that. So I remember, with Sheikh Hamza Karam Ali, one of my teachers, we were just starting the Bayquniya and he gives us this CD, right? This is back in the day, right? He gives us the CD and says, start researching this hadith. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm just started Bayquniya. Like, I don't even know what I'm researching. What does it mean to research if I don't know what I'm researching? But you realize very quickly that it's just not like that. The science of hadith is very hands-on. Like you have to like look at stuff and take things apart and question things and read these things. So going back to the pedagogy, when you have good pedagogy for fiqh, that's essential, right? So you sat down and said, oh, well, fiqh is based on hadith and Quran and hadith, so let's do tafsir. You're not going to be a good fiqh if you do tafsir, right? Period. Like that's not how you study fiqh. So you study as much tafsir as you want, you're not going to be a good faqih. So yeah, but eventually, yeah, after 200 years, but it's not good pedagogy. If you just sat down and did three books in Hanafi fiqh, you'd be quite good, right? You're kind of aware of quite a lot of stuff. That's good, you know. Um, and so bad pedagogy in fiqh would be, doing things like that. Bad pedagogy in nahu, right? You study Kitab Sibawayh, like when you're going to finish that book and how you can even understand it. And he's jumping from this topic to that topic. It's just all over the place, right? Or Usul al-Fiqh, you're going to read the Risala of Imam Shafi'i or some kind of early commentary on it or something like that. It's just bad pedagogy. Whereas for Hadith, it's not like that. You need to pick up Bukhari. You need to see what he's doing. I remember just, in a Hadith class in Bukhari, it mentions that Bukhari says that Farabri said that so and so. And I'm like, isn't Farabri his student? So how is Imam Bukhari narrating from his student? And then you realize this manuscript actually has the chain up to Bukhari. Other hadiths. I remember just reading in Riyadh al-Salihin, and there was this chapter on the merit of dhikr, okay? And in Riyadh al-Salihin, it has this two hadiths that are they're very similar from the same Sahabi. One hadith says the comparison of somebody who remembers Allah and the comparison of somebody who does not remember Allah is like who knows the hadith? Comparison of somebody who remembers Allah and somebody who does not remember Allah. Or so rather, the comparison of somebody who remembers his Lord versus somebody who does not remember his Lord is like the living and the dead. That's the hadith, right? That's in Sahih Bukhari. And then straight after it in Riyadh al-Salihin, there's another hadith that says the comparison of a house in which Allah is remembered and a house in which Allah is not remembered is like the living and the dead. Okay? So for me, this is how the muhaddith works. He's like a detective. So it's interesting that the same Sahabi, I don't know who it is, can't remember now, narrates the same hadith with two very similar content, but slightly different. And one hadith is in Bukhari and the other hadith is in Sahih Muslim. So if they're both Sahih, why aren't they both in Bukhari and Muslim? Like what's going on? Right? So then this is the mindset and the process of the muhaddith. Pick up Fath al-Bari, start researching. My teacher didn't say go and pick up Fath al-Bari, but I was like, okay, let's go and pick up Fath al-Bari and research it. Dig, 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 dig. I realize the hadith in Bukhari is actually incorrect. It's not two hadiths, it's one hadith. The hadith says, مثل البيت الذي يذكر الله فيه والبيت الذي لا يذكر الله فيه مثل الحي والميت. The hadith is the hadith that's in Sahih Muslim. The hadith that's in Bukhari is not actually the hadith. That's actually a mistake or a paraphrasing. It's like, oh my God. So nobody came and told me that. And if you study Mustalah Hadith, they'll tell you if the hadith is da 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 da, and then Ibn Salah will tell you, well, where do you find a Sahih Hadith? You find it in Bukhari. So, no one's going to come along and challenge a hadith in Bukhari, i.e. the content of the hadith in Bukhari. But the hadith itself, the wording at least, that is not correct, right? How did I find that? Through digging, through questioning, right? Nobody came along and said, oh, it's in this textbook and that textbook, right? All sorts of things. I was talking to Sheikh Talal Ahdab recently, and he was talking about, and so he again, just as with this mentality, he had been digging around in a book, and he found this very important quote in the Ilal of Ali ibn al-Madini about the development of the madhahib. How did he stumble upon that? You just got to dig around. You find things, right? And I had used it in one of my talks. He said, "Mashallah, I used that." And he's talking very, he was just happy that I used it, etc. But again, how did I find that? Nobody spoon-fed that to me. You just have to dig. The letter of Imam Malik to Layth ibn Sa'ad about Amal of Ahl Medina, it's found in the very end of Tarikh of Yahya ibn Ma'in. So there's this huge book on hadith narrators, and right at the end of it, there's this random letter that's narrated with a chain transmission, and it's a really important. It's found in Tartib al-Madarik of Qadi Iyad in the history of the Malikis with his chain, but it's also found there. It's like, wow, that's really important. Countless very important things. So what I'm trying to say is the with hadith, it's a very different kind of thing. Hadith is just think about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes was not sat down and educated in how to solve crimes. He just knows things and he ferrets things out and he questions things and he's familiar with the world. He knows about how the height of a dog. He knows about certain things in history. He knows about certain things in chemistry, right? And he connects the dots and he's like, this doesn't make sense. This is what's going on, right? And so you have to so what's the phrase in British English? A nosy Parker, right? Somebody who's just ferreting things out. That means you just have to read a lot, right? And so you do have to have some structure, but too much structure is not very useful because it doesn't really take you anywhere, right? You did Bayquniya and in your head you have different categories of hadith. That's fine, but they don't really mean that much until you've actually picked up hadith, and then you pick up a hadith and start picking the hadith apart and say, well, who's this narrator and what does it even mean, and how did this book even reach me, and what's a manuscript, and what's this and what's that, and you go through things bit by bit by bit, and then things start to click, right? So it's one of these things that's very hands-on and practical. It doesn't require super amazing pedagogy. It needs a lot of research versus something like Nahu or fiqh or aqidah, which needs very good pedagogy. Otherwise, you're just totally lost. Does that make sense, inshallah? Okay, so why is Sahih Bukhari considered a book we are unable to critically analyze any hadith in it? That's not the truth. So, as one of my teachers said, the reason why Bukhari is so amazing is because we know all of its problems. So all the problems are exposed, as opposed to a book that we don't hasn't been. So it's been researched to death, so we know everything about it. Right? Ibn Rajab al-Hanbali, look at his commentary on 40 Hadith Imam Nawawi. He'll tell you a hadith, for example, the hadith كن في الدنيا كأنك غريب أو عابر سبيل. كن في الدنيا كأنك, yeah. So be in this world as if you are كأنك غريب. It's just a stranger or somebody passing by. The hadith is not da'if, but it's not on the conditions of Imam Bukhari, even though it's in Sahih Bukhari. So all of these things are exposed. Right. So it's an issue of imagine, for example, you're investing in a company, you don't know how good or bad it works, versus you're investing in a country, you know exactly what's going on. Yeah, that's because it could be blanket criticism, uneducated criticism, but that's not. Look at the Hadith scholars, the Imam. Who is it? I have an article on like science, like what it is on Seeker's Guidance about science and religion. And you see, for example, Ibn Hajar criticizing the very content of a hadith in Bukhari. So Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, the Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani. So the point is methodology. It's not, they're criticizing. So there's certain people come today, they don't have a proper methodology. They have a bid'ah in their methodology that they criticize. The hadith doesn't make sense to them, so they ignore it. The hadith is I don't know, something off they have oversimplified analysis of the hadith, as Imam Sheikh Al-Bani rahimahullah, like, certain his hadith that he criticized Bukhari is like that. It's like oversimplified methodology, and so it comes up with strange conclusions. And so then it's more of an issue of methodology as opposed to the actual specifics. Right? Okay, so Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. We are going to not read every single thing, but we need to go through. So we mentioned basically this book does two things. It does it goes through Mustalah al-Hadith, and it goes through Ilal al-Hadith, and it goes through specific narrators as well. So it's quite a long book. So Imam al-Tirmidhi, all we really need to know is huge hadith scholar of the early period. What does that mean, early period? Meaning, he's going to be narrating with asanid, right? So he will narrate a hadith between him and the Prophet with a full chain. He will never be referring to hadiths in a general sense. What does it mean in a general sense? Is, for example, someone like Imam al-Dhahabi, right, who is centuries later, will not quote his whole chain every single time he quotes a hadith, because that's annoying and pointless. Why is it pointless? Because by the time of Tirmidhi, right, he's born in the early 3rd century and dies at the end of the 3rd century. So look at the date there, right? By his time, hadiths are widespread. And so basically every single hadith that Tirmidhi hears, hundreds of other people have heard, right? Hundreds of other people have heard. And so, but by the period of, for example, of his teacher or his teacher's teacher, the hadith is not being heard by that many people. So it's not widespread. So Tirmidhi is not recording a hadith that is unknown, and people like Tirmidhi, but they're recording these hadiths, and then this book has become sufficiently useful and widespread that it's become a standard. So now we quote Tirmidhi, even though this hadith is most likely found in 5 other places, right? Um, so the issue is basically once a hadith becomes widespread enough, a historical fact becomes widespread enough, you don't quote your sources. That's the basic idea. So Imam Tirmidhi is useful, or Tirmidhi or Ibn Majah, or these people, they're useful because they're living in a time where things are not super well known, and so it's useful to quote your sources, right? So that's what it's useful. It's kind of like a primary. These are primary sources for things, meaning here's documented primary sources, right? As opposed to somebody saying, you know, um, an electron has a negative charge. Why would you mention your source? There's no need to do that because it's so obvious. It's not an issue of debate or anything. Um, you know, the Prophet ﷺ encouraged us to be good to our mothers. We all know that. I'm not going to quote a source, right? And so anybody of that early period is useful because they're quoting their sources, and he's going to make with the chain transmission. He's also a hadith critic, meaning he's not just quoting sources; he's telling us about things. So that if you were to study one hadith book in your life, the hadith book to study is Jami' Tirmidhi, right? It's an absolutely amazing book on so many levels. So he's a hadith critic and he's a hadith narrator, right? That's all we really need to know right now. And he's a student of Tirmidhi, of Imam Bukhari. So a lot of the discussions we're going to see, we'll talk about that. So it's a really, really important, he's a very, very important individual. He's also a student of the students of the Imams of fiqh. So he's also a faqih, right? And then we can skip here. So al-Ilal of Tirmidhi. So Imam Tirmidhi has 2 books, right? So let's just read here because it's useful. It says, وَالْعِلَّ مُفْرَدْ جَمْعُهُ عِلَلْ وَالْعِلَّةُ بكسر العين وتشديد اللام المفتوحة تطلق في اللغة على معان متعدية يمكن إرجاعها إلى أصل واحد etc 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 etc. Skip, 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 skip. It says أما في اصطلاح المحدثين فالعلة سبب خفي يقدح في صحة الحديث وظاهره السلامة منه, right? So this is the kind of the term of the late scholars, right? There's this fishy, odd thing that the default look of the hadith looks fine. When you start comparing all the chains and other information, you suddenly realize, oh my God, this is totally off, right? I imagine I'm looking at a picture and there's a person and there's his head and there's his body. Like, what's the big picture? I turn to the side and I look again and again and again. I realize there's something off with the lighting. And then I realize that that's an AI image, right? It's like AI. So, if AI is really good, you can't tell the difference. But sometimes you can. You can look at the shadow is not that amazing, right? And you look again and again and again. So the Zahir, you look at it, there's a man standing there. Later on, you realize that's not the man's torso. It's not the same body, actually, right? So things like that happen. It's clearly this doesn't add up with this. This kind of person does not relate from that person. That doesn't make sense. Yes, this person's reliable, that person's reliable, but this person does not relate from that person. And he certainly doesn't narrate information like that, right? And if he did narrate information like that, he would mention it here, but he didn't. So what's going on? Right? Or inconsistencies. This clearly goes against this. This seems should be reliable in principle, but it's not. Because look, it's not adding up. So sababun khafiyun yaqdahu. It tells us the hadith is not sahih. وظاهره السلامة منه. The default that when you look at the hadith by itself, it look fine, right? So the most simple illah is inconsistency, right? In that this hadith, you narrated the hadith in one way, but other people narrate hadith another way, right? So the hadith mentioned "Kun fi dunya ka'annaka ghariban aw 'abir sabil." Look at the hadith in the chain in Bukhari, looks fine. Compare that same chain with Ibn Hibban with Muslim, and you realize, oh, there's an inconsistency in the chain, something off. And a lot of time inconsistencies are insignificant. So سبب خفي لا يقدح في صحة الحديث. It's not a big deal, right? So a lot of the criticisms of hadiths of Bukhari and Muslim, for example, by Daraqutni and others, they're kind of like technical things, right? Really insignificant. Oh my God, the new Mercedes-Benz is really, really bad. Why? Look how much criticism it's received. What, from like top engineers who are talking about really fine things that don't really matter to me and you, right? So then he just talks about different books, etc., etc. We spoke about that somewhere else. Skip, skip, skip. So then he says, Kitaba al-Ilal lil-Imam al-Tirmidhi. So he has two books, right? So he says, أبحاث الترمذي في العلل أبحاث جليلة دقيقة هي شاهد صدق على إمامته وتقدمه في علم الحديث عامة وفي العلل خاصة آه، حتى أشاد العلماء بها وأثنوا عليها وللإمام الترمذي كتابان في العلل أحدها العلل الكبير يسمى أيضا العلل المفرد separated قد درج الترمذي في كتاب العلل الكبير هذا على الأصل الذي ذكرناه في التصنيف على العلل أنه يجمع الأحاديث المعللة ويبين علة كل حديث وقد ظفرنا بنسخة خطية من هذا الكتاب بترتيب أبي طالب القاضي. So i.e. we don't have the whole book. We found a manuscript of it from a certain date, right? Written by Abu Talib al-Qadi. I'm not sure which date that is, maybe a few hundred years after Imam Tirmidhi. So this is the default, ladies and gentlemen, is that the world's books reach us through manuscripts. And most of these manuscripts have no chain of transmission or no verifiable chain of transmission, and they're not complete, right? So people write books. The default is books are not copied en masse. Therefore, the book disappears. So, for example, um, uh, Beowulf, right? So when you go and you're studying Beowulf in English literature, and you're like, oh, this is Anglo-Saxon English, and it's like, do we actually know who wrote the book? No. How do we find the book? We found the book probably like couple hundred years ago, I think, in some church when it was burning down. We don't know. We have one manuscript of it. We don't have other manuscripts to compare the book against. We don't know who wrote it, why he wrote it, or when he wrote it. But it's pretty interesting. That's all. Who wrote the Epic of Gilgamesh? We have no idea. When was it written? Well, probably this date. Probably this. That's the default of all literature in the world, including all Islamic literature. I mean, including all Islamic books, right? Unless a book is super famous and it's copied en masse in the time of the narrator of the author, and you have lots of different manuscripts across the world and lots of people referencing it, the book gets lost. That's the nature of things, right? The default is every book will get lost. Somebody writes a copy, two copies, and that's it. And it just rots away somewhere and disappears. So that's the default with all with the whole of the heritage. That millions of books are written, 99% of it doesn't reach us. أتم ترتيبه على الأبواب. So he basically, so this Abu Talib al-Qadi, I'm not sure who exactly who and when he was. He basically he copied it out, changed the order based on the categories of fiqh. وأفرد الكلام على الرواة الذي لا يتعلق بباب معين. And he changed the order as well. When Imam Tirmidhi is talking about a particular narrator, it's not really particular to a particular chapter, he put it separately. أفرده في فصول في آخر الكتاب فجاء مستكمل الترتيب. It's all organized, right? So, but it's not complete, right? It's to mention here المطبع المطبع something, I don't know, where is it? قد قمنا بدراسة لهذا الكتاب في فصل خاص في كتابنا الإمام الترمذي. So this was his PhD or master's thesis that Tirmidhi says, and he spoke about that thing, right? But it's not complete. That's the issue. It's basically parts of something, right? People write books. We don't have them anymore. That's just the nature of how things work. الثاني هو علل جامع الترمذي الذي نقصده ونعرف به فيما يلي. So now we're talking about the علل which comes at the end of comes at the end of جامع الترمذي. It says علل جامع الترمذي يسمى أيضا العلل الصغير وهو موضوع بحثنا وموضوع شرح الحافظ ابن حجر. So this is what we're talking about. وقد وقع خلاف في شأن العلل الصغير هذا، فرأى بعض الشراح أنه كتاب مستقل كتب مع الجامع كما طبع كتاب الشمائل مع الجامع في طبعة الهند. Right? So is, for example, the Shama'il, which is about 500 hadiths, is that a chapter of his book or is it independent? So again, another problem. I speak. People organize my words. I write a book. People organize my books. Is this a 5-volume book or 5 books? Right? It's just the nature of things. So we see, for example, Shama' al-Tirmidhi, here's the hadiths, it's narrated by Imam Tirmidhi from these different people, organized in this way, but is that part of the Jami' or is it something else? Right? It's obviously difficult because let's say there's a student of Tirmidhi that your chain goes through and is this narrated by him or not? Sometimes it's even difficult to know who wrote the book. So I know this content is from this person, but did you write this book? Right? So, or who organized this book and made this a book? Right? It's not very easy to see. حيث إن بعض رواة الجامع رواه عن الإمام الترمذي مفردا عن الجامع. They mentioned by itself. Right? ورأى بعض الشراح أنه بحث تابع للجامع كالخاتمة له للتعريف بمصطلحاته. Others say no, it's part of the book. والرأي راجح أن هذا الكتاب العلل الصغير تأليف تابع. It is a part of the جامع بدليل ما في أوله وأثنائه من عبارات تربطه بالجامع مثل هذه العبارات etc. It says جميع. So for example at the beginning of this book it says جميع ما في هذا الكتاب من الأحاديث فهو معمول به. Right? So he says this book. That's how the book begins, or he refers to this book. So the book before it, i.e. the Jami' of Tirmidhi, obviously the two books are the same. وإنما حملنا على ما بينا في هذا الكتاب, this book, من قول الفقهاء وعلل الحديث etc. So he says he's referring to it at the end of it, so it must be one book. So now the Bayt al-Qasid, what does it even talk about? So Ibn Rajab is going to explain this book. What does this book talk about? He says موضوع علل جامع الترمذي. He says أطلق الترمذي هذا الاسم كتاب الاسم على كتابه هذا بمعنى غير المعنى المتعارف لهذه التسمية وغير المشهور عند المحدثين من معنى إلا. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean what we mean by إلا. إنما أراد الترمذي ها هنا من علل المعنى اللغوي وهو السبب، وذلك أنه إنما يبين في كتابه العلل الصغير هذا قواعد وأصولا عامة وهامة في قبول الروايات وردها، مما يدل على أنه لم يطلق كلمة العلل بمعنى المشتهر بين المحدثين، بل أراد المعنى الأعم، أي علل قبول الروايات وردها، لما أن المذكور في هذا الكتاب كما قال العلامة الغنغوهي. So this is not Kangohi, this is Gangohi, right? Late Indian hadith scholar. فيه ما يدل على التوثيق والصحة. وقد أودع الإمام أبو عيسى الترمذي كتاب العلل الصغير هذا أصولا حديثية ومسائل جعلها مثابة, right, a place to go back to, يرجع إليها قارئ كتاب الجامع، كما أنها قواعد وأصول عامة في علم الحديث. ويمكننا بالصبر go through exhaustively والدراسة أن نرجع هذه الأصول المسائل إلى مقاصد أساسية نبينها فيما يلي. So what is he talking about? الأول بيان حال أحاديث كتاب الجامع من حيث العمل بها إجمالا. So those hadith that we found in Tirmidhi, should they be applied, should they not be applied? قال أبو عيسى جميع ما في هذا الكتاب من الحديث معمول به وقد أخذ به بعض أهل العلم ما خلا حديثين. So it says every single hadith I mentioned in Tirmidhi, some scholars have acted upon. Right, that's concept of amal. Right, very huge concept, which is a usuli concept, which is a historical concept, is a fundamental thing to understand in fiqh and everything. That's why, again, we say that the Jami' al-Tirmidhi is so unbelievably important. قال وفي هذا فائدة كبيرة تلقي الضوء على قوة أحاديث الكتاب وتنفع الفقيه في العمل بها كما فصلناه في تعليقنا على الشرح. Right, so it says that's a whole fiqh discussion and very, very important. That's one of the reasons why so many Indo-Pak scholars have, commentated on Tirmidhi and Abu Dawood, because they're more useful in fiqh than, for example, Bukhari and Muslim. Right, because Bukhari and Muslim are more focused on sihha as opposed to amal. Right, so you're going to find a hadith in Abu Dawood that is weak that everybody acts upon. Whereas you might find a hadith in Sahih Muslim that is sahih that nobody acts upon. Right, so it's pretty important. ثانيا بيان مأخذ ما ذكره من الفقه وصناعة الحديث. So when you say مأخذ, that can mean a criticism, right? A place where you grab hold of somebody, a place of criticism. It can also just mean the source, right? Literally, where did you get it from? بيان مأخذ, where did he get these things from, right? قال أبو عيسى وما ذكرنا في هذا الكتاب من اختيار الفقهاء فما كان من قول سفيان الثوري. So Sufyan al-Thawri is 1, 2, 3, 4 generations before him. Right, so Sufyan al-Thawri is same kind of generation as Imam Abu Hanifa. So Imam Abu Hanifa is like 2 generations before Imam Shafi'i, and Imam Shafi'i is like 2 generations before Imam Tirmidhi. So if you can imagine, who was born here? Anybody's born here? Everybody's born here in the 20th century? Okay, we're all born in the 20th century, right? Not 21st century. So myself, 1987, okay? Let's think about my connection to people who were born 100 years before me. Right, that's a really long time ago. Somebody who's born in 1887, that's a really, really long time ago. I have no connection to them whatsoever. 1887, right? I'm not really, that's a huge gap. So like Imam Shafi'i, for example. So Imam Shafi'i, he was born the year that Imam Abu Hanifa died, right? And Imam Tirmidhi is born so like 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 years after Imam Shafi'i died. So there's a huge gap. So there's a huge gap between Imam Tirmidhi and Imam Shafi'i and Imam Abu Hanifa. And so Tirmidhi is saying, what are my sources going back to these people, right? So just like we have a chain of transmission for a hadith, you have to have a source, so you have to have a chain of transmission for fiqh. Where did you get this quote from, right? So he says for Sufyan al-Thawri, going way back, he says ما حدثنا به محمد بن عثمان الكوفي حدثنا عبيد الله بن موسى عن سفيان الثوري. So he has two people going back in that chain. إلى آخر ما ذكره. He mentions, for example, for Imam Shafi'i. So while I studied with Imam Shafi'i's student Rabi' al-Muradi. For Imam Ahmad, I studied with so and so. For Ibn etc. إلى آخر ما ذكره من الأسانيد التي نقل بها نقل بها عن الفقهاء فقههم وآراءهم التي أوردها في كتابه. And it's worth noting, it's just a good example, that just like we can have a hadith that is, it looks fine, but it's actually not, similarly in fiqh, right? So Imam al-Tirmidhi quotes so-and-so saying that Imam Shafi said this. He said, well, that's odd because other students of Imam Shafi are saying something else. So that's the example of an illah. So by default, I would trust Imam al-Tirmidhi quoting a student of Imam Shafi. That's by default, but it doesn't have to be right. But as a Maliki, for example, am I going to give a fatwa from Tirmidhi, quoting so-and-so, quoting Imam Malik? Am I going to give a fatwa like that? No. Okay, why? Because there's problems, right? And so this is a huge, it opens a whole door, right? And if you can have problems in a faqih like Tirmidhi, quoting another faqih, right? Quoting another faqih, if you can have problems in that, do you think you can have problems in hadith? Of course, right? So that's the whole concept of hadith, is that anything that is narrated ahad, so-and-so from so-and-so, is urda lil khata, is just gonna have mistakes, isn't it? Just by its very nature, right? So this book is very important to understand. Go ahead, Bismillah Musa.
Quick question. Not for any controversy or anything like that, but there are a number of recent scholars that have challenged what these great shuyukh have said. So, for example, like Tirmidhi and the strength or weakness of a hadith. What is our approach as a student of knowledge who will be, inshallah, khair, equipped with this type of knowledge to be able to do this type of true revision of a hadith? How do we
So,
approach
so
things more
basically,
modern?
on a simple level is when we are working with a system, you have to work with that system. So what you will find is revisionists, right? Orientalists, certain modern scholars, that come along and they work with a system in other than the way that system works. And it
Okay.
doesn't make any sense. So for example, Shaykh al-Bani rahimahullah comes along, here's Abu Dawood, and sifts out weak hadiths in Abu Dawood. That doesn't make any sense. The whole point is it has weak hadith in it. Like that's part of the book. That's how the book works. So
Mm,
you're not working with it within a system. So talking to Imam Tirmidhi as Imam Tirmidhi works is totally fine, right? So you're like you're saying this hadith is fine, and it's like, well, why is it fine? Because it's narrated by so and so. See, but Tirmidhi isn't. Don't we all agree that so and so is weak? And you can't find any other evidence whatsoever. And other scholars also disagree with him, right? Like that just seems super strange. So, you know what I mean? Saying like you're working with his system as opposed to you have your weird system that doesn't make any sense. Like
mm,
you're not really you're just kind of doing crazy stuff, right? And so so as long as you're working with that system, it's not the end of the world. Right. And what you will find, subhanAllah, is the other thing then is just to bear in mind that Tirmidhi always has more information than you do. Right. So this is one of these things like talking about taqleed, right? People, oh, we don't do taqleed. Like we do taqleed all the time because we simply don't have the raw data that they have. Right. So someone like Tirmidhi, he went from Balkh, goes to Balkh, and goes to Rai, goes to Rai, he goes to Fustat, he goes from Fustat, he goes to here. And he's heard that self-same hadith, the self-same hadith from 20 different shuyukh, different sources. And the hadith is all messed up. Every single time he hears that self-same hadith, it's in a totally different version. So he's going to say there's a problem with this hadith, and you're like, what problem with the hadith? Habibi, did you live in the third century and travel to all these different cities and hear this hadith 20 times? No. You don't even have access to that. Like Tirmidhi will say, "Wafil babi kada," and in this chapter, there's another hadith that we don't even have that hadith. So we have to, we're dealing with this situation. We often have this kibr, right? This is the kind of modern Orientalist or whatever thing, like the pride, like, oh, we know they didn't know. It's true. Sometimes we know things they don't know. But the default is they know things that we don't know, right?
mm,
They just have information that we don't have access to, right? Just like simple as that. Um, and they don't necessarily give us, they don't necessarily give us all of their information. So therefore, we just have to listen to them, right? Imam Ahmad says this hadith narrator is weak, and that is the only source we have on that hadith narrator. What are you going to do? Like, You know, or say, for example, I've seen 10 of his hadiths that are mistaken. You only have two of his hadiths to begin with. Like today, we only have two of this particular hadith narrator's hadith to begin with. He's seen hundreds of them. So obviously he has more information. So I'm just kind of in a situation where I have to just do taqleed because I'm how am I supposed to criticize him, you know? Like he is the field researcher. I'm not. I'm not even there. I don't even have access to these things. So these are two things. You follow a proper methodology, right? And realize they have more information. And sometimes, yeah, it's not going to make people criticize Tirmidhi. They'll say like, how is this hadith sahih? Or how is it, you know, it's just odd. Or just at least know what he's doing, right? Um, as opposed to kind of doing crazy things that don't really make sense. You're not working within the same system. You're not working with kind of and that's the main thing. That's bid'ah. Like that's real bid'ah. It's like you have a new system that nobody's had before, academically, spiritually, religiously, whatever it is. Like it's just like nobody works like that, and it doesn't make any sense.
تمام جزاك الله خير يا شيخ.
You know, like, just classic example. Oh, the hadith is weak, therefore we don't apply it. Like Tirmidhi will tell you the hadith is weak, and everybody acts upon it. Like that happens a lot. It happens a lot. He says the hadith is weak, and then he says, but so and so and so and so and so and so of the Sahaba and Tabi'een and the Imams act upon it. So you come along with this very oversimplified situation. If the hadith is weak, we don't act upon it. That's an oversimplification. That's the default, but the default is often not the case, right? Or sahih, right? Is that the hadith is sahih, but nobody acts upon it, right? And so you're coming along and creating a new deen from your pocket that it's not doesn't reflect anybody. Nobody works in that way at all, right? And then suddenly you are the Salaf, right? We're like, this is kind of it's crazy. But key thing, know that they have more facts than we do, right? And by default, and have a sound methodology, and then everything else can be fine, right? So I'll give you an example. Like one of my teachers, you know, he's not a person of bid'ah. He's just an academic, you know. So he, for example, the hadith on music in Sahih Bukhari, he says this hadith is weak, right? So he's not criticizing Bukhari itself. He's just has an opinion on the specifics of it. So you couldn't come along and say this person's a person of bid'ah and crazy this and crazy that, and he's saying it's not really like that. You can listen to him or not listen to him, but he has a system, and it's the same system as Imam Bukhari. It's just the specifics are in there, as opposed to somebody comes along and it's like, oh, this hadith in, you know, this hadith in Bukhari is misogynistic, and you know, it's these kind of hadiths that you know rely on Bukhari that you know, or like we don't even have the manuscript of Bukhari, so we can't trust it. Like, what are you even talking about? Like, what do you have any manuscripts of? Right? So they will make these statements like a Quraniyun people like really confuse individuals. It's kind of like a very teenager, like inconsistent approach of looking at things. They don't really know what they're talking about, right? So they'll look at a chain transmission like, ha ha ha, look, haddathana, haddathana. Everything in the world is haddathana, haddathana. Everything, right? You don't trust this, you don't trust that. Like you're gonna have serious problems in every single thing. Where's your chain of transmission for any book that anybody has written in the last 100 years? You don't have it. You don't have a chain transmission back to, I don't know, Jack London for White Fang. Like, do you have his manuscript? Probably not. That's the default. You don't have manuscripts. You don't know that he actually wrote this thing. It's just well known in his lifetime, and that's good enough, right? There's actually no chain transmission. So you start questioning things. I only accept things that are mass narrated. Like that's not true. Who lives life like that? So your methodology is off. That's what it is. Your methodology is like always inconsistent. That's the key thing. Like your methodology is inconsistent, right? Does that make sense, Musa?
نعم جزاك الله خير يا شيخ.
It's like a Salafi who studies tajweed, right? You'll find many Salafis, right? They'll study tajweed. So where does tajweed come from? Where's a hadith? Give me a hadith, Sahih hadith for tajweed. Idgham. And they say, oh, it's not like that. What they say is that actually they don't understand what tajweed is, but because they haven't really thought about it, it's okay. But in reality, if you apply the Salafi methodology to tajweed, it's all a bid'ah. If you apply it, there's no Sahih hadith for, I don't know, 3 counts on this, or, where's that? Right? And the same, then you'll follow the same Salafi approach. You're eventually going to become a Qur'aniyun people. That's where it goes, right? So it's a continuum. It's an oversensitivity and over criticism without nuanced methodology. It results in that whole thing. And ultimately, you're going to be doubting every single thing in the world. Um, like you shouldn't trust this class because how do you know it's not AI, right? So where do you draw the line? Like this could just be an AI person, right? I could be a bot and just advertise a class that don't even exist. Why not? It's not that difficult. But where do you draw the line of like what you should there's a difference between certainty and conviction and levels of conviction and how you deal with these things in a nuanced way. They don't have that nuanced way and it's just all over the place. Okay, let's just find a good place to pause, inshallah. So, what was number one? He mentioned, so basically, what does he talk about in this book? He talks about the general thing that everything that the book is acted upon, um, his sources for the fuqaha. That was number two. Number three. So, I'm going to need you to write this down, okay? So, someone's going to have to summarize it. So, number one, he talks about, so somebody could type this in the chat. Imam al-Tirmidhi talks about number one, um, that all the hadiths in his book are acted upon. Number two, his sources for the fatwa that he's quoting, right? Which again, not going to be necessarily reliable, which is very important to understand because fiqh is narrated through talaqqi of fiqh. Like tajweed is narrated through talaqqi of tajweed. It's not narrated through a chain transmission. It's not like the same thing. Number three, bayan usulin fi ulum al-ruwah. Okay, so it says بين الترمذي مشروعية, right? This is a modern word, right? The مشروعية, how do you translate مشروعية? The legitimacy, right? Legitimacy of a jarh al-ta'dil, which is essentially غيبة, right? ورد على الذين انتقدوا كلام المحدثين في ذلك بسبب تحرجهم, like they find it difficult من الغيبة التي توهموها في جرح الضعفاء وقد شدد الترمذي النكير right, it got very angry with them وعبر بقوله وقد عاب بعض من لا يفهم وبين الترمذي أقسام الرواة وأحوالهم وحال كل قسم فمنهم من هو هومتهم بالكذب أو كان مغفلا فمنهم من هو متهم بالكذب أو كان مغفلا يخطئ الكثير. So كثيرا he means الكثير here, this is for الجنس. كما عبر الترمذي ومنهم من يتهم أو يضعف لغفلته أو كثرة خطئه ومنهم أهل صدق وجلالة قد زكاهم قوم بجلالتهم وصدقهم وتكلم فيهم آخرون من قبل حفظهم. So they're good people, they're good but they make some mistakes. وأوضح الترمذي حكم كل طبقة مما سيأتيك بشرح الحافظ. So, here's just a whole example, right? In theory versus practice. Theory. Ibn Hajar, for example, in Nukhbat al-Fikr, he breaks down hadith either accepted or rejected. Is that in reality the case? It's not really. Hadith is not really accept. It's like, it's either good or it's bad. It's not really the case. That's theoretically, right? Theoretically, it's like that. In reality, it's not like that. In reality, it's a continuum, right? You look at how qiyas works theoretically, how qiyas works practically as fuqaha. Very different, right? There's a huge difference between how does a faqih work, what do fuqaha actually do, and in theory. So, my point I was trying to make in the beginning of the class was You need to actually see what they're doing, right? A discussion in usul, should we accept a mursal hadith or not, as opposed to playing with mursal hadiths, right? Play with it. I want to buy a car, so you thinking theoretically about a car. Bro, just buy a car, play with a car. Do you like this car? Do you like that car? Was it annoying? Right? Know that you could take it back within a month. So just play around with some different cars, find out what's cheap, find out what's good for you or for the function that you want to achieve, and go with it. It's great. You know, if you can afford it. Oh, I can't afford that one. Okay, get another car. Get this one, get that one. Right? Just play around with how it works. So it's very important, so he talks about these kind of things so a key concept, every single science is a knack before it's a science, right? Karate, nobody came and invented karate. People did martial arts and then they invented karate. It became codified. Fiqh is a art and then it becomes a science. Tajweed is an art and then it becomes a science. Hadith criticism is an art and then it becomes a science, right? So that's why just look at, Imam Bukhari and Muslim are doing hadith before there's any books on Mustalah al-Hadith, right? Imam Shafi'i did not invent usul. Imam Shafi'i codified usul. There's a huge difference, right? So he talks about these things and, different levels of hadith narrators and who we should rely on, who we should rely on, who should not rely on, etc. So that's number 3. Number 4, inshallah, we'll finish with this point. رابعا بيان أصول علم الرواة وقد بين الترمذي في كتاب العلل الرواية بالمعنى فحكى جوازها. So a concept. Everybody's doing this in reality. Can you narrate can you paraphrase? جواز التحمل بالعرض وهو القراءة على الشيخ. Can you recite to your teacher while the teacher just listens without even saying about it? كيفية الأداء لمن تحمل بالعرض وأنه يجوز له عند الرواية أن يقول حدثنا. So even though he didn't, can you say things like he told us even though he didn't tell us? When you read to him. Al-Ijaza, can you just can someone just give you a book and say, I give you permission to narrate this book from me? فله أن يرويه عنه حدثنا محمود بن غيلان حدثنا وكيع teacher of Imam الشافعي عن عمران بن حدير عن أبي مجلز عن بشير بن نهيك قال كتبت كتابا عن أبي هريرة فقلت أرويه عنك قال نعم فروى عددا من الآثار في جوازها. Right? So he's talking about, can you do that? Right? I wrote a book, copied a book from Abu Hanifa, from Abu Huraira, and said, can I narrate it from you? إلى آخره. And then he's going to go on to this other thing that, inshallah, we'll talk about this, inshallah, for next week. Start here. So if somebody else could just summarize your notes, whatever notes you have, whatever made sense to you, didn't make sense to you, in brief on the chat, and then, inshallah, people can add things or question things or etc. So as long as people don't share things on the chat that don't make any sense, like don't share another class, don't share, I don't know what it is, you can post whatever you want. Right? Inshallah. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. سبحان الله وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك.